So first, states, nations, empires, and maps. In order to understand states and nations, we have to remember what political maps are. Right? Political maps are made up of independent states whose borders have been shaped by events of the past. So the legal lines that say where one country ends and another begins is a political border. And political power is expressed geographically. That means it's expressed over a specific space that is like delineated within a border as control over people, land, and resources. So they get to tell people what to do. Politics helps determine how land is used and divided up, and how we use and divide up our resources too. And types of political entities, so like different configurations for politics, is what we're going to be talking about today. States, nations, nation states, empires, that sort of thing. So at this point, please prepare to take notes on definitions. And as we do this, think about how each concept is different from the other concepts on the slide. It's going to be tricky. These are abstract concepts, but these are social studies vocabulary words that you will use for the rest of your life. And if I say anything that you have questions about, please drop them in the comments. Okay, states. A state is a word. This is the first of many words that you're going to have to sort of unlearn in order to use it correctly in social studies, because in everyday language, we don't use it very precisely. A state is a territory ruled by one government with formal borders. It is what most people mean when they say a country. It's complicated because in the United States, we use states when we really mean provinces. Texas is technically a part of the United States. The United States is a state. We call Texas a state because at the very beginning of the founding of our government, each independent state like Texas or Massachusetts, Texas wasn't around when we founded our government, they wanted to act like independent states that just came together for mutual protection as a federation. But really, a state is like the United States, or like Mexico, or France, or Nigeria, or Saudi Arabia, or Iraq. That's what most people mean when they say a country. So a political unit with a formal government and legally defined boundaries, a country. A nation is different. A nation refers to a group of people with a distinct cultural or ethnic identity. So that means that a nation is more about how people feel about who they are as a people together. It doesn't necessarily involve legal borders. And I'll go through a couple examples in a minute so that you can kind of get the difference. But a state shows up on a political map, right? A state has borders. That's what we look at on political maps. A nation, you won't necessarily see on a map. It's about how people feel. Do they feel connected to one another through culture? If yes, that's a nation. Nations and states don't always overlap. But when they do, we call it a nation state. A nation state is a state, so a place with a legally defined border and a government where almost everybody belongs to the same nation. So everybody feels connected to one another culturally as part of their identity. A nation state is what you want because they're pretty stable, because what you have is people who feel connected, ruled by a government that they feel connected to. I'm going to say what it means a bunch of different ways, hoping that maybe one of them will stick. So you can also think of a nation state as a form of government that combines the political and geographic idea of the state with the cultural idea of the nation. The people in the territory feel a sense of belonging and identity, tying them to a formal legal territory and government. So we've got an interesting comment in the chat. Caesar says, so basically not the USA, and that is a fascinating thing to say. And it is a defensible position to take, especially in this moment in time. I don't know how much you guys follow politics, but things are kind of crazy right now, right? And we have a country, a state, with lots of different people in it, and they don't all feel connected to one another. You don't have to know this word yet, but what that's called is polarization, political polarization, when like the people are increasingly divided and see each other as fundamentally different from one another. And that causes conflict. So yes, Caesar, that is a brilliant comment. I'm impressed. You can defend that position. Another example of when a nation and a state might not be the same thing is like, tell me empires are next. Yes, empires are next. Empires, right? I'll go through the definition and then I will tie it back to nation and state in just a second. Actually, knock it out right now. Write down the definition of empire while we're going through it. An empire is slightly different. It's a kind of state. So empires are strong states that expand by conquest, by taking over other nations and their stuff, by force, usually. And if you look up on the slide, you'll see the Roman Empire rising and growing, expanding by conquest. Empires don't expand into vacuums usually. They usually expand into places that other people live, so they take over other places. That means that they, as a state, take over other nations, and people of those nations now belong to this bigger, more powerful state that they feel no connection to. So in that case, you would also have a state and a nation that aren't the same. You'd have people who are just conquered, who definitely don't feel like their identity is tied to the state that conquered them. So let's write down that definition too. Empires. And we're going to use this forever in world history. Basically, everything we study in world history next year is an empire. And here too, actually, starting in Unit 3. Right, so empires are large states that are formed when a strong state conquers a weaker nation or state and absorbs it into the conquering state's territory, generally because resources, like we want your stuff and we're strong enough to take it, so we did, kind of thing. Therefore, empires contain lots of nations, right? Lots of different conquered people become part of that one big state. Although empires are no longer common, although put an asterisk next to that because they kind of are, we just don't call them empires anymore. And we'll get to that in world history. Historically, empires were when one country with a really strong military conquered many other groups of people with different cultures and ruled them by force. So again, I've given you the same definition, like 3 slightly different ways, kind of hoping that one of them will stick. All right, so states, nations, nation states, empires. Those are the 4 big things that I want you to be able to define from today. States are places with a legally defined territory and a government. Nations are people who feel a strong sense of community and identity and togetherness that fuels their identity. Nation states are when those people are represented by one state and it kind of works out and everything matches and people are happy. And empires are when a strong state conquers a bunch of different nations and rules over them by force. We can think of probably, if you, depending on how much history you know, you can probably think of a lot of cases where the nation and the state don't match up. Today, Native American tribes who live on reservations still refer to them as nations, right? Even though they're in the United States. So you have the Cherokee Nation, a group of people who feels a strong cultural sense of identity, who live in the United States. Totally different governing system, does not necessarily represent just that one nation. I'm going to pause here for questions because that was a lot. Or examples. Can anyone else think of a time or a place or a situation where a nation and a state would not match up? It's a hard question. And I can see someone typing into their OneNote that the Civil War in the United States might have been a good example too. And it's true, the Civil War occurred because there were two nations and they were trying to figure out which one of them was going to be able to have like power in the state. Yzette says The Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars. Yes, actually, you can learn a lot of history from Star Wars, but don't tell my husband that I said it because I don't really like Star Wars and I don't want to watch any of those movies anymore and he's going to make me. But yeah, the Empire was taking power over all of these little nations that the rebels represent. Absolutely. And Caesar says a lot of revolutions. And absolutely, a revolution is what happens when the nation is fed up by not being represented by the state to the extent that they're willing to become violent about it, which we cover in world history a lot too. So great job. I'm impressed with y'all. Let's move on to looking at some specific states. So you don't have to write this down yet, but I wanted you guys to get an overview of like continent, regions, and then the anchor countries from specific regions that we are going to focus on in this class. I'm going to go over these anchor countries, which we could call states, one at a time. And you could take notes on this in a couple ways. If you have space in your notes from yesterday when we went over regions, you can add details about specific countries. Otherwise, just make a list and note which region each country is in. And what I would suggest to you also is focus your energy on looking at the pictures of the slides when we go through them. It's hard to remember the locations of different states until you have a lot of reasons to remember. And my job this year and next year is to fill in all of those reasons through the story of world history. For now, I'm going to start sprinkling little details, and I'm hoping that the details will help you guys form a picture, which will help you remember the location of these countries, states, and nations. Okay, so to start off, let's cover the Americas first. These should be the most familiar to us. So for the United States, or for the Americas, you have 4 states that you need to be able to locate on a blank map. The first is the United States. We live here. I hope you can find it. There's an arrow on the slide. The United States was the very first, well, actually, modern democracy in the world. There were ancient classical democracies, but this was the first modern democracy founded on an idea of universal human rights, which we will get to. Below the United States, we have Mexico. It's where I'm from. And Mexico, as you guys know, is homeland of delicious food, wonderful people, and the ancient historical site of fascinating empires like the Mayans and the Olmecs and the Aztecs. Moving into South America, we have 2 anchor states. On the left, you'll see Peru. Peru is also the site of an amazing empire pre-conquest before the Europeans came to the Americas, the Inca Empire in the mountains. I really want to go someday. And then Brazil is the giant chunk on the right. Brazil was a Portuguese colony, unlike Mexico and Peru, which became Spanish colonies. So people in Brazil speak Portuguese, but a very pretty version of it. And Brazil is also home to the Amazon rainforest and the Amazon River. Fascinating ecosystem. So the United States, Mexico, Peru on the left of South America, and then Brazil on the right. And they kind of touch in the middle, so maybe that can help you remember. They're like holding hands or something. Or state nubs. Anyway, okay. Remember from Unit 1, don't write this down, but when we looked at resources and scarcity, we made mention of empires as forming to conquer to get resources, and then they developed trade networks. And our next 2 anchor states were homes of fascinating ancient empires in Africa that did just that. First, we have Egypt. Egypt is on the northeast little tip of Africa, connecting it to the Middle East. And Egypt was the site of one of the very earliest human civilizations in all of world history. We just call it Egypt, but still, you know, pyramids, pharaohs, hieroglyphs, that sort of thing, that developed along the Nile River. Super old, super, super fascinating empire that lasted a really, really, really long time, and I can't wait to cover it in class. Its location is kind of key to that story, though. So you have to remember that Egypt, it's like right next to the Red Sea. It's kind of the key between Africa and the Middle East. And it exists in North Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, Mali is our anchor state. And Mali also was the site of a rich and fascinating empire and the heartland of an amazing trade network that we will also study in this class. I don't know if it's this year or next year, but we will get to it. Mali is a little bit harder to find, so make note of kind of where it is. And I'm kind of hoping I added pictures. Yeah, here's some pictures of Egypt. I thought it'd be cool to add pictures because looking at these places is fascinating. I mean, I think that, okay, so on the top right, you have a picture of Cairo, huge city with like ancient pyramids in the background, a view that I think is just amazing. You've got bazaars underneath, so like there's definitely a culture of a marketplace. On the bottom left, you have a picture of the Nile River, so you can kind of, you could picture this place as both being ancient and modern at the same time, and that's kind of why I think it's awesome. I want to go too. I kind of hope I get you guys to want to travel through all of this too, because traveling is super fun. All right, moving on to Europe. In Europe, there are 3 states so far that you have to know. The first is the United Kingdom, aka Britain. Your comments are cracking me up. The United Kingdom has many names. We'll go into it next year if you guys really want to. You'll sometimes see it referred to as the United Kingdom or Britain, or less accurately as England. But it is the island off of the north coast of France. And the thing that I think is fascinating about England is like it's teeny. Nothing about that island suggests that it should have been powerful. But if you look at the map on the top right, there are only 22 countries in the world that have never been invaded by that little tiny island. So a very powerful empire, the first place to industrialize, which led to another very powerful empire for that little tiny island in the North Sea. All right, below it, we've got Italy. It looks like a boot. Italy was the site of the birth of the Roman Empire, one of the very first classical empires that I'm sure you guys know from a bunch of movies or from religious history or from general history. We're going to cover it in this class. It'll be pretty cool. You can remember it because it does look like a boot. And then finally, Russia. Russia's kind of fascinating in its own way because it is gigantic. It's as far east as Europe goes, and actually half of it is in Asia. It is huge. It is cold. It was the site of its own sort of land empire a couple of times. And it is a beautiful country. When I was 14, I actually got to go, and it is one of the most amazing places I have ever been. Like, pictures do not do it justice. Also kind of a sad place, but you know, we can talk about that later. Okay, moving on to the Middle East. The Middle East is going to be hugely important, not just for current events, not just for world history, but also for the study of religions. The Middle East is located between Europe and Africa and Asia. So historically, it's been the site of a lot of traffic and cultural diffusion, and many empires have tried to make it their home. In the Middle East, we are concentrating on 2 states. The first is Israel, and it's kind of hard to see the arrow. It's pointing to like this orange blob on the map. So it's like on the coast between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Israel is incredibly important to religious history for Judaism and Christianity and Islam. And as a result, it is the site of a lot of religious tension these days. So it's like that little orange bit. There's a detail right next to the arrow. Hard to find on a map just because it's tiny. The next big state that we're going to cover is Saudi Arabia. You can see the arrow pointing to it on the map. Saudi Arabia today is famous for being an oil-producing absolute monarchy that is also a theocracy. It's a religious state based on Islam. Historically, Saudi Arabia was the site of the birth of Islam, a huge world religion with a bunch of followers worldwide. It is deserty and mountainy mostly, and please tell me I put in pictures. I totally did. It's kind of an amazing place to look at too, just because of this combination of ancient and modern. Like these are all current pictures. On the left, there is a historic district in a town called Jeddah. I don't know, I love staring at it. It feels like a voyage in time. But then like on the right, you see, totally modern city. And then on the top right, you see a major religious site for Islam. And the thing that I think is kind of fascinating about that is it's not just like a beautiful site, like the building itself. I'll show you pictures later when we get to the religions, but it's like just great to look at. But also that site has been there since the time of the founder of Islam, Muhammad, in the year 600, when it was just a desert and it was like a little oasis town where people would stop off to water their camels and stuff between trade route stops. So Saudi Arabia, we'll get to that. I hope I've given you some reason to remember where it is. And then we don't have a whole lot of slides left. Moving on to Asia. In Asia, you will be looking to be able to identify India at the bottom, Mongolia at the top between China and Russia, China, huge key country. If you can find China, you're kind of good. And then Vietnam just underneath China. All ancient, fascinating civilizations in their own right. China, I don't think I added too many pictures of China because I ran out of time, but China was actually one of the very first river valley civilizations that founded, and over the years, like a number of empires and states have developed there, but the culture has remained pretty uninterrupted, which I think is kind of fascinating. Mongolia, just to the north of China, is also a fascinating place, to my mind, especially because it was the site of one of the least likely empires in world history, the Mongol Empire, a place where like nomads eked out a really harsh life on the steppe and then eventually managed to found a gigantic land empire, defying the odds of history for sure. If you watch Marco Polo on Netflix, that is part that covers the Mongol Empire. Okay, and India, fascinating place, also a site of a river valley civilization, so one of the oldest civilizations in the world, a very different place depending on where in the state you go to. It's got jungle, it's got the Himalayas, it's got the Taj Mahal on the top left. It was the birthplace of Hinduism, which is an ancient polytheistic world religion still widely practiced with a bunch of gods and a bunch of temples and like fascinating rites. And the Ganges River on the bottom right. All right, moving on, we've got Australia and Oceania. Australia is pretty easy to find. It's the big island among all the little islands, and Australia is unique for its wildlife. Like kangaroos and koalas live there, and they're all really cool because it's an island, and so like those species were able to develop without a whole lot of interruption from other predators for a really long time, so they developed pretty uniquely. All right, that does it for my tour of world history.